My dad told the whole church I abandoned the family business. The church owns stock in it now. My name is Nora Hartley, and I was 44 years old the morning I found out my father had given away part of a company I helped build to a church that had spent the last 15 years believing I was the reason it almost fell apart. I'm a forensic accountant. I spend my days finding the places where numbers don't line up with the story people tell about them. I did not expect to need those skills on a Sunday morning, sitting in the third pew of Grace Community Church, wearing a green cardigan my daughter picked out for me, half listening to the announcements before the sermon. Pastor Daniel Reeves was talking about the church's new ministry partnership fund. He thanked a family for their generosity. He said the words, Hartley Lumber and Supply. He said the business had been a blessing to this community for over 60 years, through 3 generations, and that the church was honored to now hold a stake in its future. He did not look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. Half the congregation already had. I felt my husband Michael's hand find mine on the pew between us. I didn't move. I have gotten very good over the years at not moving. Because here is what almost no one in that sanctuary knew, and what I did not fully understand myself until 4 months later, sitting in a lawyer's office with a folder full of documents that should never have existed. The shares my father donated to that church were not entirely his to give. Some of them were mine. I want to tell you how a business, a family, and a church all ended up entangled in the same lie, and how I spent almost a year proving it quietly, without ever raising my voice. Before I go further, if this is your first time here, welcome. I tell true, first-person stories about families, the quiet kind of harm that doesn't leave marks, and the slow, patient work of setting things right. If you've ever been the one who left something you didn't actually walk away from, I think you'll recognize a lot of this. Stay with me. Subscribe if you want more stories like it, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. This one takes a while to unfold, the way real things do. Let me take you back to where it started, because you can't understand what happened in that church without understanding what happened in the store. The store on Fenwick Street. Hartley Lumber and Supply opened in 1961, on a corner lot on Fenwick Street in Millbrook, Ohio, a town of about 11,000 people that has since grown to almost 20,000 without ever quite feeling like a city. My grandfather, Earl Hartley, built it from a single flatbed truck and a rented shed. By the time I was born, it was a proper building, corrugated steel, a gravel lot, a hand-painted sign that my father repainted every 5 years without ever changing the font. I grew up in that store the way other kids grow up in a backyard. I knew the smell of cut pine and machine oil before I knew the alphabet. I knew which floorboards near the register creaked and which drawer in my father's desk stuck in humid weather, and I knew, long before anyone told me directly, that the store was not just a business. It was the family's proof that we mattered. My father, Walter Hartley, took over from Earl in 1979 when he was 26. He was proud of that in a way I didn't fully understand until I was an adult myself, the pride of a man who inherited something and needed, badly, to be seen as having earned it too. He worked 6 days a week. He shook every customer's hand. He remembered birthdays. He also remembered, with total clarity, exactly who had ever doubted him. My mother, Margaret, worked the books in the back office for the first 15 years of their marriage, before my brother Kevin and I were both in school full-time. She was quiet in a particular way, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned, long before I came along, which things in that family were worth saying out loud and which things you just carried. Kevin is 3 years younger than me. Growing up, he was the funny one, the one who could make our father laugh at the dinner table, the one who never seemed to carry the weight the rest of us did. I loved him. I still do, in the complicated way you love a brother who was handed something you worked for. Because here is the thing nobody said directly until I was almost 30. The store was always going to be Kevin's. Not because I wanted it less, not because I was worse at it. I started working the register at 12, doing inventory at 14, learning the supplier contracts by 16 because my father let me sit in on meetings when he was in a good mood and needed someone to nod at the right moments. I was better with numbers than either of them. I loved that place. But I was a girl, and in my father's mind, a mind shaped by his own father, and the version of Millbrook that existed in 1961, a hardware store was a thing you passed down to a son. He never said it in those words. He didn't have to. He said it in 100 smaller ways. Who he brought to supplier dinners, whose name he put on the truck insurance at 18, whose opinion he asked for first at the dinner table when the subject was the business, and whose opinion he asked for first when the subject was anything else. I want to be fair to him, because this is not a story about a monster. My father was, and is, a man who genuinely believes he built something good and gave his children a good life. He is also a man who cannot tolerate the idea that anyone, especially his own daughter, might have a truer account of events than the one he's already decided on. Those two things lived in him at the same time for my entire life. I left for college at 18 to study accounting, which my father treated at the time as a slightly embarrassing hobby that would be useful for the store later. I came home every summer and worked the floor. I graduated, and instead of coming home for good, I took a job at a regional accounting firm 2 hours away in Columbus. My father called it finding yourself. He said it the way other people say, going through a phase. I met Michael there, an engineer, steady, the kind of person who asks good questions instead of offering fast opinions. We married when I was 26. My father gave a toast at the wedding that mentioned the store 4 times and Michael by name twice. By 29, I had my CPA, a good job, a 1-year-old daughter named Sophie, and a standing, unspoken understanding with my father that someday, I would come back to Millbrook and help run Hartley Lumber the way I'd always helped, except properly this time, with a title and a say. That someday arrived on a Tuesday in March, when my father called to tell me the accountant who had done the store's books for 11 years was retiring, and would I consider coming back to take it over. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Coming home. Michael and I moved back to Millbrook that summer. We bought a house 12 minutes from the store, close enough that I could walk over on my lunch break, which I did almost every day for the first 2 years. I want you to understand how good those 2 years were, because it matters for what comes later. I wasn't just doing the books. My father brought me into supplier negotiations. He let me restructure the store's payment terms with 2 of our biggest vendors, which saved us almost $40,000 a year in early payment penalties we'd been eating for a decade. He introduced me to customers as the smart one, which embarrassed me and also, if I'm honest, felt like something I'd been waiting my whole life to hear. Kevin was 26 then, working the floor and doing deliveries, restless in the way men in their mid-20s often are, not sure yet what he wanted, coasting on being liked by everyone who walked in the door. He and I got along fine in those years. We weren't close exactly, but there wasn't tension either. I don't think either of us had yet realized we were about to be put in competition for something neither of us had asked to compete for. The tension started with a lumber contract in the fall of 2011. A regional construction company, Danforth Builders, wanted to make Hartley Lumber their exclusive supplier for a new subdivision going up on the east side of town, 80-some houses, a contract worth, over 18 months, somewhere around $600,000. It was the biggest deal the store had ever been offered. I put together the numbers. I ran 3 different financing scenarios because taking on a contract that size meant carrying more inventory than we'd ever carried, and it meant a business loan to cover it. I recommended the middle scenario, a $180,000 line of credit through Millbrook Savings, structured so we'd be debt-free again within 14 months of the contract ending. My father took the proposal, thanked me, and then brought Kevin into the room to get his read on it too. Because, he said, Kevin would be the one managing the deliveries day to day and should have a voice. Kevin's read on it was to suggest we go with the largest financing scenario I'd modeled, the one I'd specifically recommended against, because it would let us also renovate the showroom at the same time, since we'd already be dealing with the bank. My father loved that idea. He called it thinking bigger. He took Kevin's version to the bank. I want to be precise here, because precision is the whole point of what I do for a living. I was not upset that my father sometimes disagreed with my recommendation. I was upset that when he did, it was never framed as a disagreement about numbers. It was framed as Kevin having vision and me being cautious. Over the following 18 months, as the renovation ran 9 weeks over schedule and about $22,000 over budget, and as 2 of the Danforth houses fell through and left us holding lumber we'd financed but couldn't sell at full price, I watched my father's account of what happened quietly reshape itself. It became a story about market conditions. It became a story about Danforth. It never became a story about the version of the plan that had actually been chosen and by whom. That was the first time I understood something I would spend the next 13 years learning in increasingly expensive ways. In my family, being right about the numbers was never going to matter as much as being the one my father had already decided to believe. The Christmas card. I need to tell you about a Christmas card, because it's a small thing, and small things are usually where you can see a family's real shape most clearly. In December of 2012, my mother sent out the family Christmas card, a photo of my parents, Kevin, his then-girlfriend Denise, and Michael, Sophie, and me, taken at the store in front of the big wreath my father hung over the register every year. On the back, in my mother's handwriting, it read, "From the Hartleys of Hartley Lumber and Supply, 3 generations and counting." I remember standing in my kitchen holding that card, feeling something I couldn't name yet. It wasn't that I was left off it. I was in the photo. My name just wasn't attached to the business in the caption, the way Kevin's already was, even though at that point I had been running the company's books and half its vendor relationships for 2.5 years, and Kevin was still, technically, a delivery driver with a good attitude. I didn't say anything about it. I told myself it was a caption on a Christmas card, that I was being sensitive, that my mother probably hadn't thought about it at all. I have gone back and forth over the years about whether that was true. I think now that it wasn't really about the card. It was about the fact that I had already, quietly, started keeping a small mental list of moments like that one, not because I was building a case, not yet, but because some part of me already sensed I might need to remember them someday. The first real fracture. By 2014, I was 32, Sophie was 5, and Michael and I had our son Ben. My father, at 62, was starting to talk more seriously about retirement, and more specifically about succession, a word he used constantly that year, usually in the context of Kevin. In April of that year, my father called a family meeting at the house, just the 5 of us, him, my mother, Kevin, Denise, and me, around the same dining table where I'd eaten every Sunday dinner of my childhood. He announced that he was restructuring Hartley Lumber and Supply into a formal corporation, with shares, ahead of eventually stepping back from day-to-day management. He said he wanted to be fair. He said he'd thought about it a lot. The plan he laid out gave Kevin 51% of the company with the title of president. It gave me 9% with no title. It kept 40% in my father's name to be transferred later at his discretion. I remember the exact sound of the room after he said the numbers. Denise looked at the tablecloth. My mother refilled a water glass that didn't need refilling. Kevin looked, I think, almost as surprised as I was, though he recovered faster. I asked, as calmly as I could manage, why the split wasn't more even, given that I had been running the financial side of the business for 4 years and had a professional credential that directly applied to running it. My father said, and I remember this sentence precisely, because I have thought about it more times than I can count since, "Someone has to be able to make the final call, Nora, and Kevin's the one who's going to carry the name." I asked him what that meant, exactly, given that my name was also Hartley. He said, "You know what I mean." I did know what he meant. I think everyone at that table knew what he meant, and I think that was exactly why no one else said anything. I didn't fight him on it that night. I want to be honest about why. I told myself 9% was still something, that titles didn't matter as much as being in the room, that I could earn more later by continuing to prove myself. I also told myself, and this is the part that took me years to admit, that if I pushed too hard, I would be confirming the story my father already seemed to be building about me, somewhere in the back of his mind. That I was difficult, that I wanted too much, that I couldn't just be grateful. That is a very effective trap, if you've never been in one. The harder you push for fairness, the more it looks, to the person holding the power, like proof that you were never going to be satisfied. I signed the shareholder paperwork 6 weeks later. I want you to remember that moment, because it becomes important much later in this story. in a room with a lawyer named Priya Chandrasekaran, 20 years further down the road, when I learned that the 9% I signed for that day was not actually the 9% I ended up with. The push. For the next 2 years, I stayed. I want to say that plainly because when people eventually heard the phrase, Nora abandoned the family business, it erased 2 years of me showing up every single day to a company where I owned 9% and had no real authority, doing work that made Kevin, who owned 51%, look competent. I restructured our supplier contracts again in 2015, saving another $30,000 annually. I built the spreadsheet system Kevin used, without credit, for every major decision he made for the next decade. I trained the part-time bookkeeper who eventually replaced me. I did all of this while my father increasingly ran business decisions through Kevin first, as president, even when the decision was purely financial and squarely in my area, not his. The push when it came was quiet. It usually is. In late 2016, my father told me he thought it might be healthier for the business if I stepped back from day-to-day financial management and focused instead on special projects, his words, while a new full-time bookkeeper, someone Kevin had already interviewed and liked, took over the daily books. He framed it as reducing my workload since I had 2 young kids. He framed it, in other words, as something he was doing for me. I asked him directly whether this was Kevin's idea. He said it was a joint decision. I later learned, from my mother, in a moment of rare honesty over coffee about 8 months afterward, that Kevin had gone to my father alone and told him he felt undermined having his sister run the numbers when he was supposed to be president. My father agreed with him. Neither of them told me that conversation happened. I only ever got the version where it was a decision made with my well-being in mind. I left Hartley Lumber and Supply in March of 2017. I was 35. I took a senior position at a Columbus accounting firm, the same firm, coincidentally, where I'd started my career. I kept my 9% ownership stake because my father asked me to, for the family, and because Priya, whom I hadn't met yet, but would come to trust completely, would later tell me that keeping it was, in fact, the single smartest financial decision I made in that entire painful year, even though at the time it felt like agreeing to stay tied to a place that had already let me go. I did not resign in anger. I did not raise my voice in that final meeting with my father. I remember saying, quietly, "I think this is the wrong decision, and I think you already know that, but I'm not going to fight you on it." He didn't answer me. He just nodded, the way he nodded at customers he was ending a conversation with. What I did not know, walking out of that building for what I thought was the last time as an employee, was that my father had already begun telling a different story about that day. One where I had chosen to leave, where the business had never needed me the way I believed it did, and where my departure was, eventually, going to become useful to him in a way none of us could have predicted yet. 600 miles of silence, more or less. I want to slow down here, because the next several years matter, even though very little happened in them, in the dramatic sense. This is usually how it goes in real families. There is rarely a single explosive event. There is a long, quiet accumulation of small choices, repeated so many times that they start to look like the truth. Between 2017 and 2021, I saw my parents at holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, the 4th of July cookout my father hosted every year at the store, using the loading dock as a stage for lawn chairs and a folding table of hot dogs. I was polite. My father was polite. We did not discuss the business, by unspoken agreement, the way some families don't discuss politics. But I started to notice things. At Thanksgiving in 2018, my Aunt Carol, my father's older sister, a woman who has always said the thing everyone else is thinking, usually one glass of wine passed when she should ask me, in front of the whole table, "So are you still doing the books over there, or did that not work out?" I said I'd moved back into public accounting the year before. She nodded slowly and said, "Huh, your dad made it sound like you just wanted to try something else. Good for you, I guess." I remember the specific physical feeling of that moment, a kind of cold drop in my stomach, followed by a strange, useless urge to defend myself against an accusation no one had technically made. I said something like, "It was more complicated than that," and changed the subject because it was Thanksgiving, and because I still, at that point, believed that saying more would make me look defensive rather than honest. At Kevin and Denise's 10th anniversary party in 2019, Denise introduced me to a woman I didn't know as Kevin's sister. She used to work at the store before she decided to go do her own thing. I smiled. I did not correct her. I have thought about that smile more than almost anything else in this story, because it is the exact moment I can point to and say, this is where I started collecting evidence, even though I didn't call it that yet, even though I told myself I was just being observant. By 2020, during the early months of the pandemic, my father gave an interview to the Millbrook Gazette-Courier for a feature on local businesses surviving COVID. In it, he talked about the store's 60-year history, about passing it to Kevin, about family businesses needing family commitment. A reporter asked whether he had other children. He said, "My daughter went a different direction professionally. It happens." The quote ran exactly like that, 4 words that did an enormous amount of quiet work, went a different direction. I read that article on my lunch break at my desk in Columbus, and I remember closing the laptop and sitting very still for a long time. Michael found me like that when he called to check in. I told him about the article. He asked me what I wanted to do. I said, honestly, nothing. There's nothing to do. It's just a sentence in a newspaper. I believed that at the time. I want to be honest that I believed it. It took me years, and a lot of therapy with Dr. Elaine Cho, to understand that a sentence repeated enough times, in enough rooms, becomes something much larger than a sentence. It becomes the water everyone in a family and a town is swimming in, so consistently that eventually no one, including, almost, me, remembers there was ever a different version of events. By 2022, when people in Millbrook found out I was Walter Hartley's daughter, the reaction I got, more than once, standing in line at the pharmacy or the farmer's market, was some version of, "Oh, are you the one who left the business?" Said kindly. Said with no malice at all. Said the way you'd ask about any known, settled fact, the way you'd ask if I was the one who'd moved to Columbus or the one who'd had twins. I had become, in my hometown, a settled fact about myself that wasn't true. Grace Community Church. I should tell you about the church now, because it's been present in this story the whole time, even though I haven't named it directly until this point. Grace Community Church sits 2 blocks from Fenwick Street, close enough that half the congregation could, and did, walk to the hardware store after Sunday service for whatever they'd forgotten during the week. My grandfather helped fund the original building fund in 1968. My father has served 2 terms on the church's finance board. Hartley Lumber has donated materials for every church renovation since I was a child, the new roof in 1994, the Fellowship Hall addition in 2003, the accessibility ramp in 2011, which I personally helped price out, back when I still had a say in things like that. Pastor Daniel Reeves came to Grace Community in 2015. He is a careful, gentle man, 58 years old, the kind of pastor who remembers everyone's name and genuinely means it when he asks how you're doing. He is also, I would come to understand, a man deeply uncomfortable with conflict, especially conflict involving one of the church's most generous and visible families. He has never, to my knowledge, done anything with actual malice. But comfort with the powerful, even when it isn't malicious, has its own kind of cost, and other people usually pay it. The church's finances are handled day to day by a woman named Ruth Palmer, 61 years old, the church bookkeeper for going on 18 years, a precise, careful woman who has quietly kept that congregation's books balanced through 3 different pastors and at least 2 building campaigns. Ruth and I had known each other casually for years, mostly through crossing paths at church potlucks. Neither of us had any idea in 2022 how much we were about to need each other. Michael, the kids, and I still attended Grace Community most Sundays, even after I stopped working at the store. It was, and is, my church too, not just my father's. That mattered later, more than I expected it to. In the fall of 2023, my father turned 71. That winter, his cardiologist found a narrowing in one of his coronary arteries that needed a stent. It wasn't life-threatening, the doctor said, but it was, in my father's words, a wake-up call. I think it's important to say that I do believe that health scare was real, and that it did genuinely push him to start thinking seriously, for the first time, about his legacy, not just the business, but what would be said about him, and about our family after he was gone. I just didn't yet understand what shape that thinking was going to take. The estate planning meeting. In February of 2024, my father called me, not Kevin me, which should have told me something, and asked if Michael and I could come to dinner the following Sunday, because he wanted to talk about getting his affairs in order. We went. My mother made a pot roast. My father, looking thinner than I'd seen him in years but steadier than I expected, told us he'd been meeting with an estate attorney to update his will and to think about what he called the future of the business beyond me and beyond Kevin's day-to-day. He said something that surprised me at the time in a good way. He said, "I've been thinking about your grandfather. He always said Hartley lumber wasn't supposed to be about any one of us. It was supposed to outlast us." He said he wanted to do something that honored that, something bigger than just passing the whole company to Kevin outright, something that connected the store permanently to Millbrook itself, to the community that had built it up over 60 years. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd been talking to Pastor Reeves about some kind of partnership. I asked him what that meant specifically. He said he hadn't decided yet. He asked me, and this is the part I've replayed the most times since, whether I would be willing to sign some paperwork later that spring to help simplify the ownership structure ahead of whatever he decided, since my 9% was, in his words, just going to complicate things otherwise. I asked him directly what paperwork. He said Kevin's lawyer, not mine, not a neutral estate attorney, Kevin's business lawyer, a man named Gerald Voss who had represented Hartley Lumber's corporate interests for over a decade, would draw something up, and that I should just take a look at it when it came. I did not sign anything that night, but I also, and I want to be honest about this because it matters, did not push back very hard. Part of me still wanted to believe my father was doing something generous. Part of me, even after everything, still wanted the story where he finally, at 71, saw me clearly. The waiver. The paperwork arrived by email in April of 2024 from Gerald Voss's office, addressed to me. It was 11 pages long, full of the kind of dense corporate language that is specifically designed to be skimmed rather than read. It described itself as a shareholder restructuring and waiver agreement. I did what I do for a living. I read every page twice. I made notes in the margins. And on page 7, in a section titled Waiver of Future Distribution Rights, I found language stating that I agreed to waive any claim to future stock distributions arising from any reorganization, donation, or transfer of company shares undertaken by the majority shareholders, in exchange for a one-time payment of $40,000, described as final settlement of minority interest. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with that document, feeling the specific, cold clarity that comes over me at work when a set of numbers that's supposed to look clean suddenly doesn't. $40,000 is not nothing. But 9% of a company that, by my own conservative estimate from years of doing its books, was worth somewhere between $4 and $5 million, was worth considerably more than $40,000, especially if there was already a plan in motion to move a large block of shares somewhere else entirely. I called Priya Chandrasekaran that week. I had got her name from Jenna Alvarez, my closest friend from the Columbus firm, who had used Priya for her own divorce and trusted her completely. Priya is 53, sharp, unhurried in a way that made me trust her immediately, and she has a habit of asking exactly one more question than you expect, right when you think the conversation is over. I sent her the waiver. She read it in front of me in her office, and then she looked up and asked, "Has anyone told you yet what they're planning to do with the shares this waiver is protecting?" I said no. I said my father had mentioned something about a partnership with the church, nothing specific. Priya said, very calmly, the sentence that changed the entire direction of the next year of my life. "Nora, I don't think you should sign anything until we understand exactly what this is protecting them from, because right now, you'd be waiving a right without knowing what the right is worth." I did not sign the waiver. I told my father in a short, careful phone call that my own attorney had advised me to hold off until the full plan was finalized. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I hope you're not going to make this difficult, Nora." I told him I wasn't trying to make anything difficult. I was trying to understand what I was signing. He didn't bring it up again for 5 months. I now understand why. he didn't need my signature yet. He needed something else first, and he was already, quietly, working on getting it. Homecoming weekend. In September of 2024, Millbrook held its Founders Weekend, a town tradition going back decades, tied loosely to the anniversary of the original county settlement, with a parade, a chili cook-off, and a Saturday evening banquet at the community center where the Chamber of Commerce gives out its annual awards. That year, Hartley Lumber and Supply received the Chamber's Legacy Business Award for 63 years of continuous operation. My father gave a short speech accepting it. Kevin stood beside him. I sat at a round table near the back with Michael, my mother, and Aunt Carol, clapping along with everyone else. My father's speech was warm, funny in the practiced way he's always been able to be in front of a crowd, and it told the story of the store from Earl's flatbed truck to the present day. Near the end, he said this, and I wrote it down on a napkin the second I got home, because I wanted to remember it exactly. I've had 2 children who each, in their own way, had to figure out where they belonged. Kevin found his place right here, running this business the way his grandfather would have wanted. My daughter Nora found her calling somewhere else, and I'm proud of her for that too, even though it meant stepping away from all this. The room applauded. It was, on its surface, a generous, even loving thing to say about a daughter. I want you to notice what it actually did, because it took me months of therapy to fully name it. It rewrote an involuntary push as a voluntary calling. It framed a business decision made by him and Kevin, without me, as something I had chosen, for reasons of my own, unrelated to anything they had done. Denise found me afterward, near the coat check, and said, warmly, genuinely, "Your dad's speech made me tear up. It's just so sweet that you two are both doing what you love." I said thank you. I did not correct her either. I have thought, many times since, about how many small moments like that when it takes to build a version of a person's life that isn't true, and how almost none of the people repeating it mean any harm at all. I drove home that night mostly in silence. Michael, who has known me for 18 years and can read my silences the way I can read a balance sheet, finally said, somewhere on the highway, "You've been quiet since the banquet." I told him what my father had said, word for word, because I'd already memorized it. He was quiet himself for a moment, and then he said, "That's not what happened, though, is it?" It wasn't a question, exactly. I said no, it wasn't. The bulletin. 3 weeks later, I sat in the third pew of Grace Community Church on a Sunday morning in October, and Pastor Reeves made the announcement I described at the start of this story, thanking the Hartley family for their generosity in establishing a ministry partnership that gave the church an ownership stake in Hartley Lumber and Supply. I want to walk you through exactly what I felt in those first 60 seconds, because I think it matters more than the version where I say, I was shocked. What I actually felt was a kind of doubling, half of me sitting perfectly still in the pew, nodding along the way you do in church, and half of me already running the numbers, already trying to calculate what percentage of the company he could possibly have given away without it touching my 9%, because surely he wouldn't have touched my 9%. After the service, in the fellowship hall, over lukewarm coffee and the store-bought cookies that appear at every church function in America, I found my father near the folding table by the window. I asked him, quietly, evenly, what percentage of the company had gone to the church. He said, 15%. It's a good thing, Nora. It ties the store to this community forever, the way your grandfather would have wanted. I asked him where the 15% came from, whose shares, structurally, had been used. He said mine mostly, some of Kevin's. It's all been handled properly, don't worry about it. I did not say anything else to him that morning. I said goodbye, gathered Sophie and Ben from Sunday school, and drove home. I called Priya from my car in the driveway before I'd even gone inside. I said, I need you to find out exactly whose shares those were. What the cap table actually said. It took Priya 6 weeks, working with a forensic colleague of hers, and eventually, a subpoena-adjacent request through the church's own legal counsel, because a 501, c. 3, receiving a substantial equity donation, has disclosure obligations whether the donor wants attention or not. What she found, laid out finally on a single spreadsheet she printed and slid across her desk to me on a gray afternoon in late November, was this. In March of 2024, 1 month after that pot roast dinner where my father first mentioned, simplifying the ownership structure. Hartley Lumber and Supply had undergone a formal share reallocation. Under the terms of my grandfather Earl's original 1979 succession trust, which had established the initial ownership percentages when the company incorporated, there existed a clause, one I had genuinely never seen, because it lived in a trust document filed with the county, not in the shareholder paperwork I'd signed in 2014, stating that any reallocation of Founderline shares required written consent from all living beneficiaries of the original trust. I was a living beneficiary of the original trust. So was Kevin. So was my father, technically, though as the controlling shareholder he'd long since treated the trust as a formality rather than a real constraint. The 15% given to the church had not, in fact, come only from my father's and Kevin's personal holdings, as he'd told me at the church that Sunday. Roughly 6 percentage points of it, 6% of a company Priya's forensic colleague, now valued at closer to $5.2 million, had been carved out of a category of shares the original trust called reserved Founderline interest, shares that, under the trust's own succession formula, were supposed to flow to me specifically, as Earl's granddaughter, upon any restructuring event, precisely because I had been the one, back in 2014, who negotiated to keep my ownership stake rather than cash out. In order to move those 6 percentage points to the church without violating the trust, my father had needed my written consent. He had gotten it. On a signature page dated March 14, 2024, a date I checked against my calendar 3 separate times, because I remembered nothing about signing anything on that day, there was my signature, notarized by a notary public I had never met, at an address in a neighboring county I had never visited. I looked at that signature for a long time in Priya's office. It looked like mine. It was not mine. The quiet discovery. I want to tell you what it actually felt like in that moment, because it wasn't rage, not yet. It was something quieter and stranger, a kind of vertigo, the specific disorientation of realizing that a piece of paper with your name on it has been moving through the world, representing you, saying things on your behalf without your knowledge for months. Priya let me sit with it for a minute before she spoke. Then she said, gently, I want to be clear about what this is and isn't. This isn't a story yet. It's a discrepancy. We're going to need to be very careful and very thorough before we call it anything else. I asked her what very careful meant practically. She said it meant 3 things. First, a handwriting analyst to formally compare the signature against verified samples of mine. Second, a records request to determine who the notary actually was, and whether that person had any connection to Gerald Voss's office or to Kevin. Third, and she said this part slowly, watching my face, it meant I needed to decide, before we went any further, what I actually wanted to happen if this turned out to be what it looked like. Because there is a version of this, she said, where you go to your father privately, and there is a version where this becomes a legal matter involving a church, a corporation, and possibly a criminal referral for forgery. And those 2 versions end very differently for your family. I did not have an answer for her that day. I went home. I did not tell Michael the full details that night, not because I was hiding anything from him, but because I genuinely needed one evening to just hold it myself before I turned it into something we discussed as a couple. I told him the outline. He held me on the couch for a long time without saying much, which is one of the things I love most about him. He has never once needed to fill silence with advice. I called Dr. Elaine Cho, my therapist, the next morning. The decision. I had been seeing Dr. Cho for almost 3 years by that point, originally for what I described to her, back in 2021, as some stuff with my family I want to stop reacting to so strongly. She is 60, calm, direct in a way I've come to rely on, and she does not let me get away with performing calmness I don't actually feel, which, given my profession and my general disposition, is a skill I apparently needed someone else to hold me to. I told her everything over 2 sessions. She asked me a question in the second session that I still think about. What are you actually afraid will happen if you pursue this all the way? I said honestly that I was afraid of becoming, permanently and publicly, the daughter who tore the family apart over money. The very story my father had already half built for me, except now with proof attached, which somehow felt worse, not better. I was afraid Kevin would never speak to me again. I was afraid my mother would side with my father, out of decades of habit, and that I'd lose her too. I was afraid Sophie and Ben would grow up watching their mother be the villain in a story their grandfather told at church. Dr. Cho let all of that sit in the room for a moment. Then she asked, "And what are you afraid will happen if you don't?" I sat with that question longer than I expected to. What I eventually said was, I was afraid I would spend the rest of my life being a settled fact in other people's mouths. The one who left, the one who couldn't handle it, the one who wanted too much, while knowing, privately forever, that none of it was true and having chosen silence anyway. I talked to Jenna, my closest friend from the firm, over coffee that week. Jenna has known me since I was 24 and has a gift for asking the blunt question everyone else is too polite to ask. She said, "Nora, I've watched you build careers out of proving what actually happened to numbers that other people wanted to bury. Why would you treat your own life differently?" I talked to Tom Whitaker, a financial advisor I'd worked with professionally for years, mostly to understand, in plain terms, what 6% of a $5.2 million company actually meant for my family's future, for Sophie's college fund, for the retirement Michael and I had been building carefully for 2 decades. Tom ran the numbers with me on a Tuesday evening in his office. 6% at that valuation was approximately $312,000. Combined with my existing 9%, which the March restructuring had apparently reduced to 3% without my consent, the numbers meant that what my father and Kevin had effectively engineered was the difference between my daughter's ownership stake being worth roughly $468,000 and its being worth roughly $156,000. I did not decide in that meeting with Tom to pursue this because of the money, exactly, though I won't pretend the money was irrelevant. I decided because Tom said something almost offhand, near the end, while closing his laptop. "You know, the amount doesn't actually change what happened. Somebody used your name on a document you never signed. That's true whether it's worth $300 or $300,000. That was the sentence that settled it for me. I called Priya the next morning and told her to proceed. Building the timeline. What followed from December 2024 through March 2025 was not a confrontation. It was months of quiet, careful work, most of it invisible to my family, almost none of it dramatic in the way you might expect. Priya's handwriting analyst, a woman named Deborah Kessler who has testified in probate disputes across 3 counties, compared the March 14 signature against 11 verified samples of mine. My mortgage documents, my CPA license renewal, a notarized power of attorney from Sophie's minor guardianship paperwork. Her report, delivered in late January, concluded with what she called a high degree of confidence that the signature was not mine, citing specific inconsistencies in letter formation that I won't pretend to fully understand, but that she explained to me patiently, twice, until I did. The notary's records request took longer. The notary, it turned out, was a woman named Patricia Wren, who worked part-time at a UPS store in the next county over and who, when Priya's investigator eventually reached her by phone in February, said she had no memory of notarizing that specific document, but that her stamp had, on at least 2 other occasions the same year, been used by a client of hers for documents she did not personally witness being signed. A violation of notary law that Patricia herself seemed genuinely distressed to learn about. That client, her records showed, was Gerald Voss's paralegal, a young man named Dustin Marsh, who had brought her a stack of documents to stamp in bulk on a Friday afternoon in March, telling her they were all routine. I want to pause here and say something important. I do not believe my brother personally forged my signature. I want to be fair, the way this story has tried to be fair to everyone in it, including people who did things I still find hard to forgive. What the evidence eventually showed, and what Priya explained to me carefully so I wouldn't build a story bigger than the facts supported, was that Gerald Voss's office had drafted a consent document on my father's instruction, and that somewhere in that office, under time pressure to close the church transfer before a tax year deadline my father was fixated on, someone, most likely Dustin Marsh, though this was never fully proven, had taken it upon themselves to handle my signature rather than wait for me to actually provide one, assuming, perhaps, that I would eventually sign it anyway, or perhaps simply not thinking about me as a person who mattered enough to wait for. That distinction mattered to me. It still does. It didn't make what happened acceptable, but it changed who I was actually angry at, and it changed what I eventually decided to ask for. During those same months, I quietly updated my own will and Sophie's and Ben's guardianship documents with Priya. Not because anything urgent required it, but because going through this process made me acutely aware of how much of my life had, until then, existed on paper controlled by other people's assumptions about me. I opened a financial account entirely in my own name, separate from the joint accounts Michael and I had always used, not out of any distrust of him, but because I wanted, for the first time in a long time, one thing that was unambiguously mine and unambiguously accounted for. I also did something I hadn't planned on. I began keeping a written timeline, a simple document on my laptop, dated entries going back to that Christmas card in 2012. Not for the lawsuit, exactly. Priya had that handled through proper channels. I kept it for myself because I realized, sitting with Dr. Cho one Thursday, that I had spent 13 years being told a story about my own life that didn't match my memory of it. And I never once, until that winter, had written my own version down in one place, in order. Ruth Palmer's phone call. In February of 2025, I got a call I did not expect, from Ruth Palmer, the church bookkeeper. She asked if we could meet somewhere other than the church. She suggested a coffee shop on the edge of town, not the one near Fenwick Street where everyone in Millbrook eventually runs into everyone else. I said yes, unsure what to expect. Ruth is a careful woman, the kind who chooses her words the way I choose line items, deliberately, aware of what each one implies. She told me that in processing the church's new equity holding for the annual financial disclosure the diocese required, she had come across the underlying transfer documents, including the consent page with my signature on it. She said she didn't know anything about a family dispute, and she wasn't trying to get involved in one. But she said something had bothered her for weeks, and she felt she couldn't, in good conscience, keep quiet about it. She said, "I've filed church paperwork with your name on it before, Nora. Your signature on the accessibility ramp materials donation, years back. I looked at both signatures side by side because something felt off to me. They're not the same hand. I know that's not my business to judge, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I didn't know who else to tell." I told her carefully that I appreciated her honesty more than she probably knew, and that I already had legal counsel looking into the same thing. I asked her not to say anything to Pastor Reeves or the church board yet, not because I wanted to hide anything from the church, but because Priya had been clear that how and when the church learned about this mattered legally, and I didn't want a well-meaning conversation to complicate things before we were ready. Ruth agreed. She also said something before we parted that stayed with me. "For what it's worth, I never believed you abandoned that store. I watched you build half the systems we still use for the annual materials donation paperwork. People just believe what they're told, especially by a man who seems certain." I cried in my car after that conversation. The first time I had actually cried through any of this, months in, not from sadness, exactly. From the simple, overwhelming relief of one person, outside my own household, saying out loud that she had seen what actually happened. Preparation. By March of 2025, Priya and I had what she called a complete and defensible record. Deborah Kessler's handwriting analysis, the notary irregularity findings, the original 1979 trust document with its founder-line consent clause, Tom Whitaker's valuation, and my own 13-year timeline, cross-referenced against emails, texts, the Gazette-Courier article, and even, at Priya's suggestion, a printed copy of that Founders Weekend banquet program, with my father's award listed under Hartley Lumber and Supply, Kevin Hartley, President. Priya laid out my options plainly, in a meeting in early March. I could pursue this entirely through legal channels, a civil claim against the estate and against Gerald Voss's firm for the fraudulent consent, potentially a referral to the county prosecutor for the forged notarization, with the church as a necessary but not targeted party, since Priya believed, and I agreed, that Grace Community Church itself was a victim of the situation, not a participant in it. or I could pursue a private resolution first. A direct conversation with my father, with the evidence laid out plainly, giving him the opportunity to correct the record and return the shares voluntarily, before anything became public or legal. I chose the second path first, not because I had gone soft, but because I realized, somewhere in those months, that what I actually wanted was not to destroy my father. I wanted the truth to exist, clearly, in a room where he could not simply repeat a better version of events and have everyone nod along. If he chose, in that room, to keep lying, I would go to Priya's first option without hesitation. But I wanted to give him the chance to be the man I still, somewhere underneath everything, hoped he still was. I decided the place for that conversation would be Thanksgiving. No, I want to correct myself, because I'm telling this exactly as it happened. It was Easter, that April, the one holiday every year when my entire extended family, including Aunt Carol, gathered at my parents' house for dinner. The one meal a year Kevin and Denise never missed, no matter what else was happening in their lives. I spent the 2 weeks before that dinner organizing a single folder, physical, not digital, because Priya advised that physical documents in a family setting land differently than a laptop screen, containing copies of every document that mattered in order tabbed. I did not plan a speech. Priya specifically advised against a speech. She said, "Let the documents talk. You just have to be willing to sit there while they do." Easter dinner. Easter fell on April 20th that year. My parents' dining room smelled like it always does on that day: ham, my mother's scalloped potatoes, the particular sweetness of the coconut cake she has made every Easter since I was a child. Sophie, now 17, sat next to her cousin Tyler, Kevin and Denise's 14-year-old son, the two of them murmuring about something on Tyler's phone the way teenagers do at family dinners everywhere. Ben, 12, sat between Michael and me. Aunt Carol had already had one glass of wine before the ham was even carved. I waited until dessert. I had discussed this timing with Priya, with Dr. Cho, and with Michael, who squeezed my hand under the table once briefly before I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand that, because I think it's the most important detail in this entire story. Everything that happened next happened in the exact same calm, even tone I had used to discuss the ham 20 minutes earlier. I said, "Dad, I need to talk about something, and I want everyone here for it. Because I think everyone here has been told a version of a story that isn't true, including me, until recently." My father set down his coffee cup. My mother went very still. Kevin looked at Denise. Aunt Carol, for once in her life, said nothing at all. I opened the folder. I said, "In October, at church, we learned that the store gave 15% of its shares to Grace Community. I asked you that day whose shares those were, and you told me it was mostly yours and some of Kevin's. That wasn't true. 6% of it came from shares that belonged to me, under Grandpa Earl's original trust, and moving them required my written consent." I placed Deborah Kessler's report on the table. I placed the March 14 consent page next to it. I said, "I never signed this. I have a forensic handwriting analysis confirming it isn't my signature. I have records showing the notary who stamped it never actually witnessed anyone sign it. Someone in Gerald Voss's office produced this document and used my name on it without my knowledge." The room was silent in a way I had never experienced at that table in my entire life. My father's face did something I want to describe carefully, because it wasn't rage, at first. It was a kind of visible scrambling, the look of a man reaching for a version of the story that could still hold and not finding one fast enough. He said, "Nora, I don't know anything about a forged signature. I told Gerald to get the paperwork handled. If someone in his office cut a corner, that's on him, not me." I said, "That may be true. I'm not saying you personally forged it. I'm saying you told a room full of people at church that these were your shares to give, and you told me directly that it was mostly your shares and Kevin's, when you knew, because you'd have had to know, since you were the one instructing your lawyer, that 6% of it required my consent, which you never actually had." My mother said very quietly, "Walter," just his name. I have never forgotten the sound of it, not an accusation exactly, but not nothing either. Kevin said, "This is insane, Nora. You're accusing Dad of stealing from you at Easter dinner." I said, "I'm not accusing anyone of anything in this room right now, except knowingly telling me and an entire congregation something that wasn't true. What happens next depends on what happens in the next few minutes. I said the sentence then that I had not planned, that came out of me the way true things sometimes do, unplanned, exactly when they're needed. A family doesn't get to write your story just because they were the first ones to speak it out loud. I did not say it for effect. I said it because it was, simply, the truest thing I knew. What happened next? My father did not apologize that night. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story where everything resolves in one dramatic scene the way it might in a movie. He said stiffly that he would look into it, that he was sure there was some misunderstanding with Gerald's office, and that he thought I was blowing this out of proportion in front of the whole family. Denise excused herself to check on dessert plates that didn't need checking on. Aunt Carol, for the first time in my entire life, reached over and put her hand over mine on the table and said nothing at all, which somehow said everything. Kevin followed me out to the driveway when Michael and I left. He was angry, not at me exactly, I realized later, but at the position he'd suddenly found himself in, having spent a decade being told a story about his sister that he now had to reckon with in real time. He said, "Why now? Why couldn't you have just talked to Dad privately?" I told him I had tried in February, and he'd said he'd look into it and never followed up. I told him this wasn't about humiliating anyone, it was about making it impossible for the truth to keep getting quietly rewritten. He didn't have a response to that. He got in his car and left without saying goodbye, which hurt more than almost anything else that night, and I let myself feel that fully in the driveway before I got in the car myself. Priya had prepared for exactly this outcome. 2 days later, her office sent a formal letter to Gerald Voss's firm, with copies to the church's legal counsel, detailing the findings and requesting a voluntary correction, restoration of my full trust line ownership percentage, and a formal, written correction of the consent record, without which we would proceed with both a civil claim and a referral of the notary matter to the county prosecutor's office. Consequences. The following months were quieter than I expected, and harder in different ways. Gerald Voss's firm, facing the exposure of a genuinely serious ethics violation involving a paralegal's misconduct, moved quickly. Within 3 weeks, they issued a corrected consent record, restored my 6 percentage points, and separately, without my requesting it, Gerald Voss called Priya personally to say that Dustin Marsh no longer worked for the firm. I don't know all the details of what happened to him professionally. I try not to think about it as a victory, because it isn't one. It's just a fact. The church's response took longer, and it was, I think, the response I respected most in the entire ordeal. Pastor Reeves called me directly in May, his voice careful, clearly having agonized over the call. He said the church board had reviewed everything Priya's office sent, and that regardless of legal fault, they did not feel right retaining an equity stake that had been obtained through a document I never actually signed. He said the board had voted, unanimously, to return the disputed 6% to me directly, keeping only the 9% my father had donated from shares that were genuinely his to give. He also said something I hadn't expected, that meant more to me than I anticipated. He asked if he could correct the record from the pulpit the same way the original announcement had been made, so that the congregation would hear directly that the story about me abandoning the business had never been accurate. I told him he didn't have to do that for my sake. He said, gently, "I think I have to do it for the church's sake, Nora. We told people something that wasn't true, even if we didn't know it at the time. That matters to us." He made that correction on a Sunday in June. I was there. I don't know how to describe what it felt like to hear a pastor say, plainly, in front of the same room where the original story had taken root, that the shares had come partly from an unauthorized document, that they'd been returned, and that Nora Hartley did not walk away from anything. I cried again, quietly, in the third pew, and this time Michael cried a little too, which I had genuinely never seen him do in church before. My father did not attend Grace Community for almost 2 months afterward. My mother told me, carefully, over coffee in July, that he was embarrassed, not fully repentant, not yet, but embarrassed in a way she said she hadn't seen from him in decades. She said he'd started, slowly, saying things like, "I should have handled that differently." which from my father, at 72, after a lifetime of never once saying a version of those words, was not nothing, even if it wasn't everything I might have once wanted. Kevin did not speak to me for 4 months. Denise sent one brief, stiff text in August saying she hoped everyone could move forward. I did not respond to it right away. I talked to Dr. Cho about what forward could even mean, given what had happened, and she said something I've held on to since. Forward doesn't require forgetting. It just requires deciding what kind of relationship is actually possible with the truth on the table, instead of the one that was only possible with a lie underneath it. A different kind of Easter. Kevin called me in November, 7 months after that dinner. He didn't apologize fully, not in the clean way you might want in a story like this one. But he said, "I've been thinking about the Danforth contract, the one from years ago. I picked the bigger financing plan because I wanted Dad to think I had vision, not because I actually thought it was smarter than yours. I think I've been doing some version of that for 15 years. I told him I appreciated him saying that. I told him I wasn't interested in relitigating every year of it, but that I would be interested, over time, in a relationship that didn't require me to disappear in order for him to feel secure. He said he'd like to try that. I don't know, as I tell you this story, exactly how that will go over the coming years. I try, these days, to let things be true without needing them to also be finished. My mother and I have grown closer since then, in a specific, careful way. She has never fully said the thing I sometimes wish she would say about all the years of small silences, the Christmas card, the things she chose not to notice. But she calls me now, sometimes just to talk, which she rarely did before, and last month she told Sophie, unprompted, "Your mom built half of what that store still runs on. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." I don't think she knows I overheard that. I've decided not to tell her I did, because I think it matters more to me that she said it freely than that I got to hear it. Tyler, Kevin's son, asked me last month, at a cousin's birthday party, why he'd never really heard the full story of why I'd left the store. I told him a shortened, age-appropriate version that sometimes families make decisions that aren't fair, and that the people those decisions happen to have to decide, eventually, whether to just accept the story they're given or find out the truth for themselves, even when it's harder. He nodded slowly, the way 14-year-olds do when they're actually listening. I think, of everyone in that family, he might be the one who ends up carrying the lesson furthest. What remained? I still own my full percentage of Hartley Lumber and Supply, 3% more than I did a year ago, restored to what it always should have been. I have no interest in ever working there again, and I've told my father that plainly, without anger. Some things, once broken, aren't meant to be rebuilt in their original shape. That doesn't mean nothing was salvaged. I still attend Grace Community Church most Sundays. Ruth Palmer and I have coffee now, every few months, at that same shop on the edge of town. Pastor Reeves and I are, I think, more honest with each other than we were before, in the particular way people become honest after living through something together that neither of them chose. My father is 73 now. He is, I think, genuinely trying, in the small, imperfect ways a man his age tries, a phone call here, a comment at dinner there, acknowledging things he once would have simply repainted, the way he repainted that store sign every 5 years without ever changing the font underneath it. I don't know if we will ever have the relationship I once, as a child, assumed we would. I've made a kind of peace with that uncertainty. It's quieter than grief and steadier than hope, and it's enough, most days, to build a life around. What I know for certain, sitting here telling you all of this, is the same thing I said across that Easter table, the truest sentence I had in me that day, and I'll leave you with it, because I still believe it, maybe more now than I did the moment I said it. A family doesn't get to write your story just because they were the first ones to speak it. If any part of this sounded familiar, if you've ever been the one quietly rewritten in your own family's account of things, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from, and if this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear that the truth is still worth writing down, even years later. Thank you for staying with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.